Help support AMTV by becoming a patron, an AMTV staff member, and following us over on Twitter. Hi there guys, it's Adam Martin here, and welcome back to another video, and this is going to be sort of the closer of the BBC's 100th anniversary celebrations. Of course, you can argue this has been happening all year round. 2022 does mark 100 years since the BBC was first found and all that sort of stuff, although the concentration of celebrations have been in October, which of course was the month in which the company was actually founded, the 18th to be precise. We've had all sorts, idents, programs, puzzle books, all that good stuff. But this is sort of the closer because on this day, the 14th of November, back in 1922, that was the day of the very, very first BBC broadcast. On the radio, of course. Television certainly wasn't a thing yet. So just looking to BBC itself on the BBC News site, it says, mystery of BBC Radio's first broadcast revealed 100 years on. A little, I suppose, tribute to the day itself. It says, the BBC is celebrating the centenary of its first official broadcast. A news bulletin that included a court report from the Old Bailey, details of London fog disruption, and billiard scores. Oh, a very different time. It was broadcast by London station 2LO, but new research shows many early BBC moments came from Northern England. Hey, big up the north. It says that Manchester station 2ZY aired the first children's show and introduced the first regular weather forecast, whereas in Birmingham, their 5IT station broadcast the first official concert. So you see, we do exist up in the north. We have a big part to play in history. Thank you very much. It says the BBC that began broadcasting at 6 p.m. on the 14th of November 1922 was not the British Broadcasting Corporation of today. It was in fact the British Broadcasting Company and was made up of separate stations around the country which were operated by different companies. Yeah, that's right, of course, the British Broadcasting Corporation didn't come into effect until New Year's Day 1927 when the Royal Charter was granted and John Reith, who of course was the very first Director General, or Lord Reith as he's more commonly known these days, he went from just being like a director of sorts to the Director General. So that was the big shift. But those first 4 or 5 years, it was the British Broadcasting Company. And just to give an example of, these stations which were operated by different companies, London 2LO was run by the Marconi Company, whereas Manchester's station was operated by Metropolitan Vickers. So again, it sort of disseminates the different hierarchy structure, I suppose, that the BBC had at that time. Although it does mention, sadly, in these early days, very few records were kept of what was broadcast, which is a great shame. However, we do have this picture. This is of Arthur Burrows, who was certainly one of the early founding fathers of the BBC. Now, I don't think this picture is from the night itself, the 14th of November, but it's certainly from very early on in the BBC's life. And I mean, the setup is very primitive, isn't it? I mean, he's literally just sat there at a desk. He's got his papers, there's a microphone in front of him, and he's sat on a plain old chair. Very different from how radio evolved over the next 100 years, that's for sure. And of course, for anyone who doesn't know, the very first words were 2LO, Marconi House, London calling. However, for anyone like myself who's interested in archive, TV, material, radio, even whatever, it says new research from the very early days of the BBC has been carried out by Steve Arnold, who is a self-confessed Radio Times obsessive. His tricky task was to try to piece together the BBC schedules before the Radio Times, so named as it listed the times that the new medium shows were being broadcast, and was first published in September of 1923. So yeah, that whole nearly first year of radio didn't have any official printed documentation to the public. There was no Radio Times, so he explained he found it in gossip columns in regional newspapers mainly, people saying, oh, we listened to this last night, and this is the only record of some of these things. But now, using sources from archived documents and newspapers, Steve has begun to piece together a picture of what the early BBC was doing. I always think it goes to such great credit to these people who do all this research, because it's the same in TV, must be even harder in radio, going back 100 years now. If it wasn't written down and published, and if we don't have archived copies of those publications, then all this documentation wouldn't exist, and then we'd literally be left up to speculation, though we still are left up to speculation in some areas. For example, the Manchester station, which operated out of Trafford Park, seems to have been the best organised. It looks as though the Manchester station is probably the origins of the BBC, as much as the Marconi 2LO station in London. They seem to have had a far more professional approach. There's a lot more documentation, and it seems they knew their onions. I'd love to know more. What a phrase. They know they're onions. I think Shrek would be happy with that one.
Ogres are like onions.
So carrying on with Manchester for a second, it says, the record of Manchester's pioneering children's programme reveals that on the 15th of November 1922, so the very second day of broadcasting, Miss A. Benny, known as the Lady of the Magic Carpet, read The Happy Prince by Oscar Wilde. And one excited listener wrote, I first clapped the phones to my ears. A recitation was in progress. And then a voice announced, now children, listen to this lovely fairy story. So, I think a lot of the time when we talk about BBC Radio or the origins of the corporation in general, it does stem from London. And sure, a lot of the big players were definitely down there. But as this article is proudly proclaiming, the North had a lot to do with some of those early firsts in BBC Radio, for sure. And just because, at this time radio, it was a thing. The BBC certainly wasn't the very first radio company to get going. That was probably someone in the United States, because that was starting to boom over there. But just to show how sort of off the cuff and how random it could be or experimental it could be, it does say the very first bulletin on 2LO 100 years ago was repeated. It was because bosses asked for it to be read twice, once at normal speed and then again at half speed, before listeners were asked to say which speed they preferred. Now remember, there was no, computers, there was no way to digitally or edit this to be half speed. Like the reader, the newscaster, would have to literally speak as I'm speaking to you now, and then they would have to speak like this. It scarcely bears thinking about, doesn't it? And just, to celebrate the expansion of the BBC over the last 100 years, it says, it has 10 UK-wide radio networks, a further 2 national radio services each in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, and 39 local radio stations across England and the Channel Islands. And that's on top of TV services broadcasting in the UK and around the world, and an extensive range of digital services. So, the BBC, it's a funny one because compared to what it was in 1922, it's grown so much bigger. It broadcasts and is known on a worldwide stage. It is held up in some of those places for its excellence in not just the content it produces, but in the integrity of its broadcasts and stuff. It doesn't get it right all the time, as I always say, but no one's perfect. And just to close it off, it says some of those early radio moments, I guess the ones that still survive, will be rebroadcast from 6 o'clock GMT on BBC Radio 4 as the station's 6 o'clock news marks exactly 100 years since the evening the BBC first took to the air with its own centenary bulletin. So if you are interested in hearing that, this video is cut. That will have happened by now at this time. But if you go on the BBC Sounds app, go to BBC Radio 4 and just start their 6 o'clock news, you should be able to catch that bulletin for yourself. So yeah, 100 years since the BBC's very first official broadcast as a company. The 2LO station, I guess, operated a bit before the BBC came into it. It says that 2LO in general was the second radio station to regularly broadcast in the UK. The first was a station known as 2MT that broadcast a little bit before, and that was based down near Chelmsford. However, the 2LO began broadcasting in May of 1922 for 1 hour of a day, still in Marconi House, but then it wasn't until the British Broadcasting Company came in where 2LO became associated with the BBC. And the 2LO name, the 2 got dropped, of course, but it says in 1930, 2LO was replaced by the BBC Regional Programme and the BBC National Programme. However, LO continued to be used within the BBC itself for any technical related things in the London area, because, OL, London. And apparently the code itself, LO, wasn't changed for about 50 years until the 1970s when it became LN. So, what else do we say? We've already talked about on this channel, but we all know the advancements the BBC made, not just in radio, how it kept listeners informed during, the general strike of 1926. It very much was a lifeline for several people during the Second World War between 1939 and 45. The advent of television, the big take-up of that in the 1950s, what people call the golden age of programming in the 60s and 70s, and then trying to push boundaries in the decades since, embracing the digital world. The BBC has always tried to keep moving, and as I've said, it doesn't always necessarily meet the mark all the time. I don't think any broadcaster can. I think you couldn't point to one and say they were perfect all the way through. But as a company, as again a British institution, a worthy 100 years to celebrate for sure. And if you're curious about any other way you can learn more about this, I've already bigged this up enough, but definitely check out The BBC of People's History by Professor David Hendy. That is a big, thick old hardback book, which is a very in-depth, comprehensive history of the BBC. I highly recommend you check that out. If you want something a bit more like accessible or light-hearted with some puzzles as well. You can check out the BBC Puzzle Book, which I've also done a review on this channel, so you should go and check that out. And in terms of programming, the Centenary programming is still available to watch on the iPlayer. For the radio stuff in particular, I'd either recommend How the BBC Began Part 1. That details a lot about the early days of the Beeb, like the origins, those first early broadcasts and stuff like that. So I highly recommend you go with that first. If you want something more interesting, something that I certainly didn't know about, you should go and check out Una Marson, Our Lost Caribbean Voice. Now, it's a tale of a real-life person, Una Marson, who was a poet, a playwright, a campaigner, and would you believe the very first black producer and broadcaster at the BBC. And we're talking in like the 1930s, 40s, a time when, unfortunately, black people weren't afforded the same respect, opportunities, practically everything that white people were. So, I mean, it's a fascinating mix of like dramatic recreations and interviews and some like verbatim. They've pulled out some old recordings, the ones that still survive and stuff like that. So I'd highly recommend you check that out. It's only an hour, and again, it is available on the iPlayer for another year, practically 11 months it says. So definitely go and check that out if you're curious. But yeah, happy 100th once again to the BBC, or should I say happy 100th to the first ever broadcast from the BBC. Look how far they have come. Let me know in the comments, what was the earliest BBC broadcast you remember, whether that's on radio or on television. I doubt I have anyone who's 100 or over 100 watching this video, but if you are, do you remember any of the BBC's early days in the 20s? Let me know in those comments. Also, subscribe to the channel if you're brand new. We'd love to have you aboard. I've been Adam Martin from AMTV. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you next time. Thank you to our patrons for helping to support the show, and a special thank you to Macra, Hooks Media, Ben Freeman, Ethan Carberry-Holt, Bruce Danton, The Broken Kitsumanoid, to Bose Krotz, and Polsky Liz, our AMTV staff members.